And I will hand over to Alex, who's giving today's presentation. Thanks, Alex.
Fantastic. Okay, so thank you. First of all, thank you, Birkbeck, for inviting me to be a part of this event. Very engaging event to try and, of course, showcase the works and the events and activities that Birkbeck sort of organizes, and as a sort of way of trying to really create more awareness on what it is like to work at a business school or to study in a business school, follow courses there. So my presentation today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about, well, I'm going to be focusing mostly on how we can address sort of how can business schools sort of be a part of this sort of wave of change that we need and that we're seeing, because of course we're having so much global turmoil, a lot of events. We turn on the news or we scroll into our news feed, and it sort of almost feels as if it's like one bad bit of news after another. People are concerned, businesses are concerned, families are concerned, communities are concerned, and governments are concerned. So, and on top of all this, of course, we have climate change. And so we need to see how business schools can sort of help to address this whole mix of challenges. And that is what I hope to do today by sort of trying my best to at least address how this can be done. So the first thing I'm going to do, I seem to have lost my PowerPoint, so I'll just go back to it there, and hopefully it will appear again. Let me see where I am. Okay, so there. Maybe it's because I've been put on the spotlight, but I can't flip my slide to the next screen.
Oh, let me stop spotlighting you and see if that helps, Alex.
I don't know. No, not really. So let me just try a different way. Maybe it's something to do with mine. I do apologize for this. So I'll stop sharing and do it again. And then it should be okay. Yeah, so that should be fine. Okay. Right. So I go back to my slides, hopefully. What's happened now? That's strange. Okay, I'll do it one more time because now we're recording and it's kind of a little bit difficult to do this. So I'll do it again. Try again.
If not, I can share from this end. So don't worry if it's being weird.
Right, okay, there we are. I think I've found it. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I think now you can see it. Okay, so what we're going to do is I wanted to first have a look at sort of what's happened in the past and how we're moving into the future amidst this global turmoil, and then we look at what will future business leaders need to be equipped with and how we sort of can perhaps revisit the business school curriculum and how that can respond and be, rather than reactionary, perhaps look a little bit be a bit more forward-looking to try and gain insight into how the future will unfold against this backdrop of events, global events, geopolitical events, and see how the business school curriculum can actually play a pivotal role in addressing these issues. So, of course, it's about embedding climate and sustainability education within the business school. So really, I just want to cast your eyes a little bit in the past, which is why I said we're going back into the future in a way, because we've had literally 3 decades of different events happening around climate change. And these are, I keep losing my mouse, which is really annoying, so I'll try again. And then it's 3 decades of the Conference of the Parties, which is called COP, and then the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I think I'm going to have to ask for you to share my screen, because otherwise I'm going to have issues all throughout, because I keep losing my mouse and I can't seem to navigate. I don't know what's happened.
No worries, Alex. Sorry about that. Let me get them up now, and then
okay.
Should be fine.
Let me stop sharing. Let me show. Yeah.
Okay, so we're on this one.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah. So we had over 3 decades of different events around climate change. Yes, please, next bit. And so really we've had Conference of the Parties, which is actually the full name for COP, because many of us have heard about COP, most likely COP26, because it happened within the UK and it was in Glasgow last November. So perhaps for those of you that did not know the full name, it's actually Conference of the Parties. So we've had 3 decades of that, and also over 3 decades of reports and research conducted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Next bit, please. So really it's like from COP1 going on to COP27. So what do the numbers mean? Actually, they are just a numerical order of when the COP event takes place, the conference. It's a conference where political leaders come together from around the world to discuss climate change. And interestingly enough, COP21, so COP1, which is obviously the first one, and every year it goes up. So when we looked at COP26, it meant it was the 26th year where we had the conference on climate change. So COP1, if we go back in time, was in 1995. And at that time already, there were calls for legally binding targets on emissions. And then these are some key COP events that happened. So like, obviously, I'm not going to go through all the 26 years. But in 1997 already, it was quite clear when the Kyoto Protocol was came to being in order to try and reduce emissions. But it was only addressed, Kyoto Protocol at the time in 1997 was for developed countries. Much debate took place between world leaders as to whether to include also the developing countries to become part of the Kyoto Protocol. So initially that was in 2007, but unfortunately, this led to much debate and the collapse in talks year after year throughout the following subsequent COPs. And next slide, please. And we can see that literally there was a stall in progress on this from 2009 till 2013, where literally global leaders could not agree on whether to have the developing countries bound also with emissions targets to reduce their emissions. Eventually, with much effort, and this is why perhaps we hear about it a lot, is 2015, which was when, during the COP21, finally world leaders came to an agreement, and that is what the one is called the Paris Climate Agreement, where really they agreed to try to keep global warming within 1.5 degrees of the pre-industrial levels. So that was a key COP, key conference in 2015. 2018, we saw sort of the birth of like the Greta Thunberg movement. So the youth, she pulled not only youth, young people, but of course the global community, where she started the Fridays for the Future. And she was even given an audience in the COP24 in 2018. And then we move in more recent times. So we see that this has been happening for a long time, from 1995. In 2020, it was postponed because of the pandemic. Until then, we had, of course, COP26, which was held in Glasgow last November in 2021, where, again, world leaders were hopeful that they would reach more ambitious agreements. But these got watered down because, of course, you have leaders from all countries with different needs, different interests, different industrial, different energy requirements, different, sets of challenges. But it was agreed that at least we had the agreement that the phasing out or phasing down the subsidies on sort of fossil fuels, which were obviously what is contributing to climate change. Okay, and also there is quite an interest and commitment from financial institutions also to work towards the net zero transition, and also some countries came together to reduce and slash other issues too. Oh, I can navigate, I realize now too, so I can do it myself. Okay, So really, we saw that there's been 3 decades where global leaders came together, bizarrely enough, to address climate change. And yet now here we are in 2022, and it seems as if climate change is just something new, where really it has been there, and it has been on government leaders' agenda for many years, many decades. Similarly, the scientific community have been working very hard on climate change to produce the scientific evidence for political and business leaders. And you could see that again from 1990, we had the first reports from 3 working groups, because the IPCC has 3 working groups. And then we go up to present day, 2021 to 2022. These are the most recent reports that have been published by the 3 working groups. So why did I present you with this sort of history? In a way, it's to show you that throughout these 30 years, throughout these 3 decades, we've actually, the world was not just purely focusing on climate change because things were happening. No, the world went on, moved on, and things did happen. And we have a series of global events. And here I've captured a few of them for you, and I've tried to put them into sort of 4 categories. And I'm sure you can add, and if you wish to, you could put in the chat some others, because I'm sure you'll be able to come up with some other ones. So don't, that by all means, these are not in any hierarchical order or a priority order. It's just, I put a few down. It's almost like a back of the envelope sort of, brainstorming. And I tried to think, what has happened in the past 30 years? What has the world experienced? First of all, politically, whilst at the moment we are all absorbed with, of course, the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and of course, so we have a war on our doorstep, etc. But we must not forget that we've had, our countries, a lot of Western countries were involved in another war, and that was in Iraq. There was the collapse of the Soviet Union. So throughout this work that was being done by global leaders during the COP conferences, and also the IPCC scientists, where they were collating data and the science on climate change, other things were happening, including the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was a Twin Tower event in the 9/11, where, of course, it's sort of like suddenly terrorism became a big thing worldwide, and it changed the way we traveled with more security, governments and businesses having to address this new threat. We also have things like cybersecurity that came into, also within these 30 years. In the UK, for example, more recently, political event was the Brexit, which of course impacted businesses, impacted trade, the way the country trades. So of course that is something that needs to be factored in. And of course now the war in Ukraine. Innovation, again, in the past 30 years, we had the Channel Tunnel. We're linking England to France, which again has implications on business, but it also has implications on the environment. We saw the birth of the internet, the World Wide Web, the smartphone. So for many of you, perhaps you find it difficult to visualize a world without these innovations. Social media, but again, something that stemmed from this, is that business responded by being innovative also, and tapping into the technological innovation, and changing also the way it does business. And we saw the birth of e-commerce. Financial, we saw also in the past 30 years, things like several countries adopting a single currency, which was the euro. We also experienced the financial crash, which was a huge crisis, which obviously brought about a lot of businesses to collapse and unemployment, etc. So that was also a major event. However, at the same time, businesses were operating and still are on what we call a model which is called the linear economy. In other words, a linear economy is one where businesses use raw materials. We extract raw materials from the planet. We process them, manufacture them into products. They are sold to consumers, and eventually consumers throw them away. And then it's, instead of being a circular economy where you try to capture those resources and put them back into a new product. So as such, this is how the sort of financial aspect of the world it was and is still based. But we also see things like events like cost of living, okay, increases in cost of living, something that we're experiencing right now, and of course oil and gas prices. And then in the last column, I've tried to put sort of the major events that perhaps are more associated with social and environmental aspect. Definitely and globally, our diet has shifted over the past 30 years to a more meat-based diet. So again, because of innovation in farming and agricultural practices, and also in food production practices, it became possible for more meat-based products to be produced and sold, and of course, so people had it more widely available. That pushed the prices down, and people were able to eat more meat. But we're also experiencing more extreme weather events. We of course have population growth and resource extraction. So of course we have intensified the way we extract natural resources from the world, again because of innovation. But of course it also is linked to political, to policies. So all these, sometimes political leaders enable or disincentivize through the policies they implement, right? And of course, a social and environmental, of course, it's a health issue. We've had the impacts of COVID-19. So these are some global events that were taking place, whilst at the same time, our government leaders and scientists were also trying to get to the bottom of how to deal with climate change, because we knew that it was obviously a reality. So that is a summary of, in a way, of where we are, what brought us to where we are now. So why was that necessary? It's because at the moment, there's a lot of talk about, oh, now we can't address climate change because we've got the war in Ukraine, because of the cost of living crisis, because of the high energy crisis. But as such, the world has experienced big hiccups. And, it does not mean that in no way am I trying to dismiss the major challenges and, of course, the hardships that a war obviously does bring about. It does not mean that we do not have the skills in us as a society, from an industry, innovation, from a business perspective, a political perspective, and the social one, that we definitely have the skills to address these challenges as well as, and in fact, merge them in a way that we can address these challenges and couple them with addressing climate change. So, of course, why are we here? Why is this all relevant in the context of an organization, whether it's a university, whether it's a business? Many times, we can say that this is because of innovation. We want to be innovative in our approach. So, for example, when Birkbeck University London has introduced carbon literacy to students and staff, that was a way of being innovative, because it is trying to make changes in a way in the topics and in trying to prepare future business leaders. It also helps in reputation, whether it's a university or a business. Ethics, because it feels it's the right thing to do. There's a sense of responsibility, social responsibility. For business continuity, because we know that unless we address these challenges, business is, and our organization is bound to suffer. Legislation, sometimes, as I said earlier, policy changes can impact how we operate. So sometimes new laws are put in place where, of course, businesses become bound to them, and then there is the need to make the change. It is a profit opportunity to make profit, increase efficiencies, and also to create differentiation from other businesses or other organizations. So with that introduction, I now wish to ask you, we're going to dive into the topic of climate change, and I would like to ask you whether you could answer a few of these questions. So now it's a case of using Slido, but I should have, I don't know whether now we can do it whilst you are presenting, or whether, because we need the QR code or the code for it. So I'm not sure if we can do that, but I can bring it up. Because that should be.
I'm not sure if it's if it will work from my end, Alex. I don't know if you've got a
No.
link that you can put in the chat, but if not, we could ask people to put their thoughts in the chat or to raise their hand.
Yeah. Okay, but I suspect I'll be if I am able to. Okay. Right. If you could go to slido.com and you could put the code 471395.
I'm just putting that in the chat. So 471395. So just to confirm, Alex, this is for all participants, isn't it? They can follow that link in the chat and put in the code at the top, and then it's an interactive tool. Okay.
I'm going to see if I try to share. I'm on my screen now. I'm doing it again, and then if I can bring that, and then perhaps we could see the QR code. Yeah. Okay. Because you could also, for the benefit of the participants who are following this, you could just use your mobile phone and scan the QR code on from your screen, and you could be able to join. So the question here is, how well do you understand climate change? From 1 to 5, and that is, 5 being really well, and oops, I went to the other one, so I have to go back. Yeah, I want to keep the column active on my one. Yeah. Okay. So then we have a number of you sort of took the middle ground. Fantastic. So that's good. I'm going to move to the next one. Do you believe your organization can benefit by reducing climate change? And I've had already 3 there. Okay, so far. Okay, so at least that's good. It shows that people who are you do feel that there are benefits for a business, for an organization, when we address climate change. And now this is something about you on a personal level. Do you feel motivated to reduce climate change? Would you like to work on climate so that your impact is brought to a minimum? Okay, that's very good. All right, so really there's a lot of motivation, which is fantastic news for Birkbeck, because that means that a lot of you are interested in really working to be a part of this change. And hopefully if you are taking a business degree, and then you will become a future leader that will be leading your business, or at least supporting your business to address climate change. Okay, so why are we doing this? Because first of all, some people may say, why, but is it really that bad? Okay, at the moment, of course, we're going through a heat wave, and some people may say, well, but we've had a heat wave, when I was a little girl, or when I was a younger boy, etc. etc. So here, this is just a visual. It does have flashing imagery, so I will ask if there's anybody that is impacted by flashing imagery to please, to keep away from looking at the screen. It's very short visual video, which shows you how temperatures globally the air temperatures that have been recorded have changed from between 1880 till 2017. It's the most recent we have there, but it's at least gives us a good idea. And each little sort of circle represents the countries in the world. So it goes from, say Afghanistan, Albania, Algeria, and they're in alphabetical order because then they go to, say, Venezuela, Vietnam, Yemen, Zambia, Zimbabwe. So this is how, and now you will look at the colors, and what do the colors represent? If they are a light blue, that means that they are that the country experienced an average of 1 degree less than the normal temperature for that country. If it's a darker blue, it means it was 2 degrees colder than what is the average for that country. And on the opposite side of the spectrum, if it's a light yellow or an orange, it means it's 1 or 2 degrees warmer than the average for that country. And then if it's a red, it means it's 3 degrees warmer. So in other words, you will now be able to see, because it speaks for itself, to see how the temperatures worldwide have increased over time from 1880 till 2017. So I will now play this for you. Okay, so this is what the average temperatures were looking like in 2017. Of course, that's 5 years ago now almost. And I'm sure you can notice, and you could put your comments in the chat to how you respond to this, or what did it sort of, what reaction do you have to this? But of course, because we are, unless you'd want to unmute yourself, if you feel you'd like to do that, but it's quite clear that, of course, the globally, dear, as Greta Thunberg says, our house is on fire, and it is easy to record air temperature. So this doesn't really require very, groundbreaking science for us to be able to record air temperatures around the world and chart them annually. And then you have an average, and then you know what it's, how every country is basically experiencing an increase in temperatures. So this is why we are here, I guess, because of course we know that these things are happening. We're seeing them, we're experiencing them. What we don't sort of seem to see, because it's less, visible, and it's not so tangible, is that the greenhouse gas emissions are on the rise. And this is one of the latest slides that we have from the also from the IPCC and the United Nations, with the data there to show that greenhouse gas emissions from 1990 till 2019. And again, you can see, bear in mind, I remind you of the first few slides I had, where the past 3 decades, we had political leaders, we had scientists, and, talking about climate change. Yet despite all that, we kept seeing a steady rise in the emissions from greenhouse gases. And these are, many of them are from, of course, land use, because we use fossil fuels, methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases, the green one there, which are found usually in refrigerants and in coolants. So yes, so this is what we know. And just to explain what anthropogenic climate change means, anthropogenic means that it is caused by humans, in other words, by human activity. So because there was much debate globally, and in certain parts of the world, this is still quite debatable. Thankfully, in our part of the world, I think it is largely and broadly accepted that climate change is linked directly to human activity. Yet we still have certain areas, including countries like the United States, where it is still very much debated within society, and there are actors in society that sit on both sides of this debate. Fortunately, in the UK and in Europe, it is accepted that, you know, that the science tells us that it is, and it's, you know, we have scientific evidence to back that up. But what are greenhouse gases? First of all, they occur naturally, but they act like a blanket around the Earth, and they trap in the heat from the sun. So without greenhouse gases that occur naturally, the Earth would be too cold for us to survive. So in other words, we need greenhouse gases. But unfortunately, now, because of our human activity, there's now too many of these greenhouse gases. And then, of course, that means that there's much more, they're doing their work as they should. They're trapping heat from the sun. But unfortunately, that because of the high number, you know, the increase in greenhouse gases, it means there's more heat being trapped in, and so the Earth is warming up. Greenhouse gases, as you saw in the previous slide, where I had the chart with how they are increasing, but some of them are methane, water vapor, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide. And of course, human activity is creating these huge amounts of extra greenhouse gases, which are leading to warming of the planet, which is what we saw in that little video. And this is why we call it anthropogenic climate change. Anthropogenic means that it is induced by human activity. So of course we need to, our job is, because we know what the source of the problem is, and then it means we are able to find solutions. So of course the basic one is reduce the emissions. And then the deeper questions will be, how do we do that? And yes, the IPCC and various scientists and various, we have a lot of information out there on how we can reduce our emissions. But here I invite you to view this video just because I think it's a good visual for you to see how we can bring it down. Are you able to hear the sound, please?
I don't think we can hear the sound, Alex, or I'm not hearing it anyway.
Okay. Yeah, that is because, of course, when I shared, I did not the sound. So I'm just going to do that in a minute. Okay, so I'll stop sharing and I'll do it again. So there we are. And then, oh, stop this thing. Why don't I get the tab for share sound? That's strange. Okay, let's try it again. There we are. Okay. So that should work now. Okay. Is that okay?
Yep, all good, thank you.
Yeah.
This is the actual rate we're adding greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere today. More than 1,000 tons a second. 1 million tons every 13 minutes. 112 million tons a day. You get the picture. We need to slow down if we want to keep our beautiful planet fit for everyone to live on and achieve the global goals. By 2020, we need to put our emissions into decline. We need to cut them in half by 2030 and by half again by 2040. So that by 2050, we're emitting less than the planet can easily reabsorb, which is what they call net zero emissions. Not only will this huge change ensure a happy planet, it will also bring health and prosperity for everyone. Let's accelerate climate action for all the global goals.
So of course, because you're hearing a lot about net zero and how do we transition to net zero, this is ultimately what it was. In other words, we need to keep reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that our Earth can absorb, so that it brings it to, that's why 0 to neutral. There are some debates saying that actually we should go into negative rather than 0. So but I will not go into it at this stage. However, it is that simple. We are emitting too much. It's almost like if you have a sponge and you soak it with water, it gets to a point where it has too much water and it can't retain that water inside the sponge, and it starts to, ooze out all the water from it. So it's the same thing. We need to make sure that we do not emit more than the Earth naturally can absorb and needs from a greenhouse gas emission perspective. So now, how does this all fit within the remit of a business school? Well, business schools deal mostly with businesses, and businesses are being impacted by climate change. And we do know this because it would be very difficult to identify a business that does not have, say, offices or manufacturing plants or people that are living or sited in affected areas where, for example, there's extreme drought or floods, hurricanes, etc. So most businesses would have, this happening. So they need to sort of start to look at, okay, if our business is on the sea, on the coast, and we know that it's a place which is targeted where we're going to experience sea level rise, what do we do? Or it's an area where it's a floodplain, where it's prone to floods or prone to droughts. And then, of course, a good business leader needs to look at these risks. It's also another risk is upstream suppliers or downstream customers, which are exposed to a changing climate, so that it affects your suppliers and also your customers as a business. Of course, all businesses rely on natural resources or ecosystems, and then, of course, vulnerability to climate-driven political instability. So, of course, businesses will always be exposed to these kind of risks because of the political instability as a result of climate crisis, resource shortages, and economic downturns, as we are seeing right now. Resource shortage at the moment is, of course, energy supply, and that is something that's preoccupying businesses, but of course governments too. So businesses are inherently impacted by climate change. So they need to look at their risks and try to identify opportunities as a result. So here I've mentioned two, for example, risks that came to mind. If you have global heat stress, and then that could increase the cost of your raw materials because you're not able to source them as easily. Or you could potentially suffer revenue losses from customers that are being hit by extreme weather events. Yet on the upside, if you were to look at opportunities, you can businesses that conduct good risk analysis are able to then pivot their business in a manner that helps them to be resilient to these, or at least think of new ways of doing business. So once you understand your climate change risks, and then you'll be in a position to sort of help to protect the long-term success of your business. But at the same time, you could also be innovative and come up with new, for example, revenue streams by, say, for example, adding weather-resistant products to your product lines, or it could be a service that would be needed within this climate. So there are various ways of how we can turn these risks into opportunities, but we need to first conduct a good risk analysis. And a lot of business are now recognizing the need to do this. So, for example, some ideas from renowned people who are talking a lot about the issues of businesses and economics and preparing leaders for the future. So, for example, Keith Rowett, who's the person that has designed the donut economic model, and she's a lead fellow from the Oxford University of Environmental Change Institute. She argues that it's essential for, to ensure that sustainability actually runs within every part of the organization, from the owners and investors through to the board and the staff. If, for example, sustainability and climate, action is buried somewhere in a department or at a mid-management level, and it sort of doesn't really it's not in the forefront and it doesn't reach the senior leadership, part of the business, and then that business will not be fit for the future, because the regenerative capacity of the living world has to have a voice, because otherwise, if that business will no longer have, what point is there to do a business when your supply chain is disrupted because of an extreme weather event? So unless, this is why Kate Raworth is arguing in this way, unless these issues are really addressed at the most senior level of the business, and then that business is going to be in some, running into some trouble. The president of the Confederation of British Industry, he's recently stated that they have seen what the role of business schools would be. And for example, they say, the collaborative approach, between business, government and universities. And especially because for young people, diversity and inclusion matters, along with climate change and biodiversity. So these are surveys that are done by industry, but they match exactly the results of surveys done by students, unions. So it's quite clear that young people are looking for these things when they are wanting to join a company. So again, if businesses want to tap into the young talent, innovative and young and energetic minds, and then they really need to show a proven and track record that they are actually taking this issue seriously. And that is how they will attract young talent. But again, it's not just the business companies that will make the commitments, led by boards making commitments, but also every individual in the company needs to understand the need for this transition to net zero and to be more sustainable. And this is why every business school is preparing students to join businesses, so then they would be individuals in the company that also will be fully behind it. But they could climb up, and be in positions at higher levels within the business structure. And then they could also create the vision for the business once they do understand it. So, so there is, however, the need for business schools to perhaps, start to look within themselves and say, okay, how can we create these new business leaders? And a recent report, which was done by the Association of MBAs in collaboration with the Business Graduates Association and the University School of Business and Economics in Finland, the results show that 7 in 10 business school leaders agree that the planet's climate is changing and think human activity is the main driver of this. These were global business schools, so that's a very good indicator that at least the science is being accepted. However, for me, it's troubling that it's only 7 in 10. I would like to see that as being 10 in 10. I want all business school leaders to be convinced that climate change is linked to human behavior, because then those are business school leaders that will lead their business school with vision, and they will make changes in the curriculum to prepare, because it's their duty, their role is to prepare the young ones, the new generation, to take the baton and then move those businesses that they will join once they finish their university program, to take those businesses into the future in a resilient manner. So, and then what was interesting is that when they were asked to rate their programs out of 10 in terms of how effective they thought their teaching was in covering the role that managers should play in contributing to climate change prevention, the mean score across the leaders was 5.9. So here you could see that when they could have tried to rate themselves, there is quite a lot of evidence here to show that the business school leaders believe that there is room for improvement. And this is why we are here today doing this talk, to show that, yes, when a business school is rethinking its curriculum, that is not a weakness, it's a strength. It shows that it is responding to the current needs and the future needs. It shows that it's agile. It shows that it's wanting to be innovative, and it shows that it wants to give value and purpose, both as an organization, but also pass on those skills to their students to be able to then put them into practice in their business world, in their world. So as a conclusion to really why we need to do this is because good business education is climate and sustainability education. Because without them, despite the challenges, and we have seen, and I will just touch upon it when I'm concluding, despite the challenges that we have, and now as a result of, for example, the war and the energy crisis, actually, if we are good business educators and we have embedded climate and sustainability education in our curriculum, and then when we are faced with, for example, high energy prices, etc., and then we are the ones that will be able to drive our businesses to be innovative and, for example, to tap much more into renewables, which will not only make us more independent as a country, as a region, as a business, more self-reliant, and it will shield us from the shocks of geopolitics. But it will also, of course, be a major drive to bring down those greenhouse gas emissions, which I spoke about in the earlier part of the talk. So good business education needs to really embed climate and sustainability in the curriculum. It needs to explore new economic models and accounting tools that capture social and environmental value. In other words, it's not only about shareholders' interests, but it's also about stakeholders. You know, what is my business being of? Does it have a value? Does it have purpose? Is it of benefit to the community? Or am I a part of the destructive part? Will investors want to invest in my business if I am continuing to invest in, for example, dirty oil, etc., right? Or somewhere in my supply chain. If I am a marketing company, would I want to be taking on contracts from a company that is actually producing, I don't know, products or offering services that are actually, you know, causing more destruction to the planet? Do I want to be associated with such a business, or do I take? If I'm a bank, am I going to continue to invest assets into fossil fuels, into the destruction of forests? But the more we see this, you know, people are questioning this. And governments are starting to sort of also, you know, work on sort of policies to enable the shift away from such practices. But then, of course, we need business schools to tap into their expertise, because to create different accounting tools, different economic models, a different way of doing business, because business schools are the experts. They carry this expertise, but they also need to look into the future. We cannot use old tools, old models that worked successfully in the past, when we are literally, the world is demanding of us a total disruption of how the world was operating. So we need new tools. So a good business school would critically revisit the traditional economic and business concepts and frameworks and theories, and to further integrate climate change into all its activities, and not only within the curriculum, but also in practice. And I know that a lot of universities are actually responding quite well to this, you know, so it's important to have, you know, to lead by example. So of course, universities have premises, and they need to ensure that they bring down the emissions throughout their operations, in the supply chains, and so forth, so that they can show that actually they're not just teaching this, the theory, but also acting upon it themselves as a business school. So tapping into faculty expertise for advancing the climate change agenda within the curriculum, but also within business and society, because there is expertise in business schools, and they are the ones that can support and work in collaboration with businesses to try and help them make this change, because businesses are now not, you know, in a lecture room setting anymore. They have a business to run, so they would really value the expertise from a business school to do this. So really, when we look at how we can prepare future leaders as a business school, I think these are some things that need to be looked at. And one of the key things here, I think, if I were to capture it is to sort of look within, you know, do sort of a reflective practice and sort of say, okay, you know, what is working and what can help us to change. We need to look at what needs to change, and come up with different ways of preparing our students. And one of them would definitely be preparing students to be resilient, you know, to have skills that are transferable, because we are seeing rapid change. So that was one of the key things that I wanted to bring up to you today. And against the backdrop of course, as I mentioned, because of course we are going through a lot of turmoil, we can see that there are clear links, okay? And unless business schools are able to present these links and interconnections to students, and then everything remains very much within silos, and we look at things just purely from one angle. However, we need to look at, yes, we have a problem with gas supply. It's a fossil fuel. Can we need to be critical of, but in a sort of positive way, you know, as a learning sort of journey, to say, you know, where did we go wrong if we've been reliant too much on one global power, right? Basically for our economy. Of course, the UK is slightly better positioned, but definitely we can look at some other countries in Europe. One of the major economies, like Germany, has been extremely reliant on its energy from Russia. That's one source. Now, even if, you know, if you were to bring that down to the most simple thing, you know, if you just are basing, you know, your world on just relying your life, your personal life, on just one shop, for example, where you just buy everything from that shop, and if that shop suddenly closes, and then you have a real problem. And this is exactly, you know, extrapolating that to one of Europe's largest economies, to have its whole industry, its infrastructure, everything dependent on one source. That is now something that perhaps business schools should use as an example of saying, well, you know, where is that business model? You know, where did it go wrong? How can that have been improved? How can we make changes so that it's, you know, so that there are models and policies that actually cushion and buffer the shocks. Because of course now the businesses need the energy, they need the, you know, to continue to produce their goods, and then we have this crisis. But equally, we have a similar issue, which is emerging quite rapidly as a result of the war. It's not only the energy crisis, but the food crisis. And there again, business schools and business leaders, it's important to be able to look at the interconnections. How is food supplied? Where is the food produced? What is the supply chain? What are the production practices? You know, where are the wastages? You know, can we have, let's look at innovation, let's look at the science. Can we produce food in a more sustainable way, in a more climate friendly way that feeds more people, but it's at the same time more secure? We talk a lot about food security. But so to be a good business leader, you need to also have a good understanding of politics, because of the way policies work, and the law, because of course businesses are impacted by new legislations that come into play and come into force. So that is really, in a nutshell, how we, as you know, how business schools and can prepare the young talent to be able to see the bigger picture. And within all that, there is climate change. And actually, it fits quite well in order, whilst we want to buffer, whilst we want to mitigate against climate change, but also to create ways to adapt to the realities of climate change. At the same time, we also need to revisit our supply chains, our energy consumption, our energy suppliers globally, how we produce energy. And unfortunately, it's really important not to have knee-jerk reactions to say, okay, well, let's continue to dig coal now, and we sort of go back 20, 30 years ago. which is unfortunately what we are seeing amidst some of the political leaders as a sort of emergency measure. So really, it's ultimately important to be a force for good. So you can have a successful business. You can read up about how businesses can change in order to be a force for good, but also at the same time, business education needs to be a force for good. And that is really where I bring my presentation to an end. So I can just see if there's anyone that maybe in the chat had any questions.
Thanks so much, Alex. So yeah, please, if you do have questions, they can go in the chat, as Alex said, or you can raise your hand, use the raise hand function. I'm also just going to do a quick plug for the event survey. So I'm going to put that in the chat. We'd really appreciate your feedback. Should take a couple of minutes to complete. But yeah, please do let us know. We've got 2 minutes for questions now. There's one in the chat, Alex. Have you seen it? You're reading it? Yep.
Yeah, about energy security over climate security. Do you see this as a longer term persistent trend given geopolitical pressures? Well, I think this is where, and I didn't touch upon it, we are seeing a trend where law is really and legal litigation actually is really taking front kind of forefront, is coming into the forefront. Why? Because there's a lot now where if, for example, governments don't act, or if they act too slowly, we are seeing more and more cases being taken to court, and they are being won by environmental NGOs, by civic society. So I do think that it's really important to have grassroots, to have civic society having an awareness and really keeping our political power leaders and business leaders in check, because they will now start to see one after another, one law case after another, and they are seeing that they really need to watch it, because they will be held to account. So I think that law is going to play a real important role, which is something I never thought I would have to say ever in my career in sustainability. Okay, so yeah, thank you for sharing incorporating sustainability management education. Thank you for sharing the publication there. So it needs to be interdisciplinary, and I do hope that political leaders see that as such. They go hand in hand. Energy security, you can achieve energy security if we rely on renewables, for example, much more, if we have multiple sources rather than a single source, if we bring down our energy use, energy consumption significantly. So, okay. There's a lot at the moment, say, for example, even about marketing and greenwashing, etc. KLM, a large, obviously, airline, has been repeatedly advertising its sort of sustainability credentials and saying and making certain unfound or untrue statements in its advertising campaigns, and they've been warned. There's, civic society has told them, and they've tried to talk with them, they've had meetings with them, and KLM just said, no, we're happy to keep on like this. Basically, it's greenwashing. Well, the civic society has got together, raised funds, and they're taking them to court. They're taking KLM to court. So these are things that now businesses really need to be careful about, that if they don't operate in a clean manner, civic society is going to bite back. Yeah.
Okay, so I can see that we're 2 minutes past 2 o'clock. So I've just put a plug in there for other BEI Week events happening this week. We've got events going till Friday. Please do come and join us for another event. And again, please let us know how you found this event in the survey. I'd like to say thanks so much to Alex for your time this afternoon. I personally found it very interesting. I can see from some of the comments in the chat, there's some quite shocking things coming out of that it's really important that whatever's going on in our wider context that we're keeping on top of. So thanks so much, Alex, for your time, and thanks everyone for joining us on a warm lunchtime to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yes, thank you. And good luck with the rest of the talks. Thank you. Okay.